The Norwegian Method.
I'm Olav Alexander Bu, peak human performance developer, coach to Christian Blumenfeld and Gustav Iden.
I'm Dr. David Lippman, a health and human performance specialist, and welcome to the Norwegian Method podcast.
The Norwegian Method.
This podcast is sponsored by VO2 Master, the ultimate portable metabolic analyzer. Head to the show notes to learn how to get your first assessment kit free. Welcome back to the Norwegian Method podcast. Dave Lippman here with Olav. Welcome back, Olav.
Thanks.
Today, we are doing the run episode. I've been anxiously awaiting this as a runner. This has been the episode I've been most interested in doing with you. And, you know, we've come to this point. We've learned so much about generalized methodologies, how they pertain to swimming, how they pertain to cycling, and now we're on to running. So I think probably the first question I want to start with is, running's very unique in a triathlon because it poses the greatest injury risk from and the only eccentric loading really in the discipline, right? So you have eccentric loading, you have a greater injury risk. Does this change how you prescribe running or how you may modify load or anything like that around training for athletes?
No, not really. And one of the reasons for that is because triathletes are quite lucky in the sense that they already diversify their training load over 3 different sports. And that in itself actually acts almost like our injury prevention. Further, I think that if you look at the specialists, now there was a new world record set by Kelvin, and he already was quite open about, for example, the volume that he is putting in, and the volume that he is putting in is like enormous, probably the highest I've ever heard in history of any marathoner at that level. So it just shows that for triathletes, volume is absolutely not a problem when it comes to each of the separate disciplines. What really is the limitation is the level of accuracy or precision that you're putting in, making sure that you actually nail or let's say balance the intensities in a good way. Because one of the things that I think most people don't think about is that, like we talked about in the previous episode, we talked about so the relationship between velocity, force, and power.
Yep.
So this one basically scales exponentially. And a small change in velocity obviously will increase force exponentially, at least at some point. But that means also that even if you increase the velocity a little bit, of course, it's not like now you're doubling necessarily the total force, but it's increasing exponentially with increasing velocity. So it feels little. It might be little, like if you just measure the change in terms of, like, for example, impact loading or force change. But the biggest threat to injuries, I would very often say, is that when you're starting to fatigue a little bit, you start to shift and compensate, and you start introducing a movement pattern, which maybe then ends up stressing smaller parts that doesn't necessarily have gotten the same level of training that you normally do. So it could be, for example, that you're shifting maybe a little bit more load towards because you're collapsing a little bit less. So let's, for example, take your feet. Or your Achilles tendon and your legs, is that of course the Achilles takes up a great deal of the load when you're running. And as you start to fatigue, the Achilles obviously being one of the smaller muscles compared to, let's say, your thighs and your legs in general, that one will start to collapse a little bit easier. So you are starting to feel, for example, that you don't have the same level of, call it, springiness anymore. You are maybe striking a little bit more midfoot or even heel if you don't take this into account. But also your foot arc actually acts also as a damper in the whole equation. And when here there are even smaller muscle groups, and they will also fatigue even quicker normally. And that means that as you start to run, and if you now are starting to fatigue and you start to suddenly that you say, okay, fine, I got more left in the bank, I'm going to go harder now. The problem with that is exactly that you're now starting to shift the load maybe much more to more concentrated places in your legs that the legs is not used to, and this is when you start to see maybe injuries are occurring. So first, of course, more like soft tissue injuries, but eventually if you continue to do this over time, you also start, worst case, ending up with more
bony injuries.
Exactly.
So given that potential for injury risk and an age grouper, do you think there should be a lower threshold to perhaps not run and switch it out for another session if you are sore, if you are concerned about an area? Or do you think it's more about getting it right on the input side? So programming properly, being disciplined about that, and then you shouldn't need that.
The answer I would like
Yep.
to provide is that
It depends.
no, because that doesn't work, or it works, but it is not very applicable or very hard to apply. No, I would say that at the moment you feel any soreness or pain that doesn't go away, and you feel that is also altering your technique,
Yep.
then you should be careful. Simply because if you're starting to compensate with your technique to, let's say, remove that pain, then you're already shifting that load onto other parts of your body, which is maybe not used to have that kind of load either. So that's also, again, easier said than done, because people are not very good at even evaluating their own technique, and very often it can be even subtle changes. So I think it's important to be mindful a little bit about how things are. Don't necessarily go like full red alert just because there's a sensation there that you haven't felt before. Be mindful about it. Rather take an observation, because you can stop wherever you want. And unless this is going to tell you, oh, I'm going to break my foot now, the next step I make, sure, of course, stop. But I yet have to experience that kind of case. So I would rather say that yes, onset of, let's say, discomforts, pains, and these kind of things is not unusual. But then when you start to feel it, be mindful about it. Try to maintain your technique as much as possible as you did, like being mindful about, okay, run, like really like execute with excellent quality technique. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, where you take more like a mindful or observational approach of, okay, what is it that I'm really feeling here now? And then rather start to make small subtle changes just to see if you can identify and figure out what this really is. And then you decide on whether you're going to slow down and say, hey, I better cut it now. See whether this goes over for the next session. Or you actually feel, oh no, this is fine, I got this under control, and you continue. But again, if it starts to affect your technique, running form and so on, then and you're not able to refocus and bring yourself back without a lot of extra stress, then probably bring it down, keep it easy, quit the session, and if you need to, replace the next running session with the discipline that you're worst in, swimming session, for example, if you're not good at that.
So there's a phrase I like that may be relevant here, and it's MICLO, MICLO, masterful inactivity with cat-like observation, which just says be really mindful of what's going on and observe it very carefully to then make a decision. But so just to create an example for the listeners to really solidify this for them, I've had a pain. I think it's not a good pain. I've got an intense running session coming up, one with significant intensity. And I'm pretty happy that, I'm an even triathlete. I swim just as well as I cycle, just as well as I run. So there's not a lot of weaknesses that I need to address specifically. Is it as simple as just, hey, like for the most part, because it's a foot issue, let's just swap it in for cycling and do similarly intense work? Is that a fair way to swap that?
No, this is where the answer comes. It depends, but
it always does.
No, yes and no. If it's a very running specific issue or problem that you don't feel, or it doesn't get worse, or but it absolutely doesn't, or best case you don't actually feel it on the bike, that's absolutely a valid approach to do that.
That makes sense. And then, as you said, I mean, the bigger context around that is all the stuff we talked about before, which is, we're reverse engineering a result, and we've got a needs analysis done. So now we can actually say we're better off spending that time elsewhere. But as a rough rule of thumb, you can swap out directly if you need to, provided, as you said, it's not making it worse. And that's one of the challenges, I think, with lower limb injuries or lower limb soreness as opposed to upper limb, is it's really hard to deload. You can't not walk. People need to walk in life and all those things. So adjusting load is very difficult, because the load we quantify tends to be training loads. Some of that not even necessarily musculoskeletal as much as it is cardiovascular, and yet we're trying to deload a musculoskeletal structure which gets a lot of load from just existing. So it makes it a very difficult thing to manage, but I think that's a great answer.
Yeah.
On a previous episode, we talked about swimming drills, and there's probably some people who had their views challenged on that, which I think is positive, and I think that's part of what this is about. Where do you stand on running drills? Do you have a similar approach, which is, hey, let's barely use them, or do you use them more extensively?
No, we barely use them, but it's not because I'm against running drills. It more has to do with being very hard on the priorities of where we spend our time. And again, if Kelvin runs more than 300 kilometers a week, either he runs like freaking fast, those few kilometers or few hours that he's running, and spending all the rest of the hours on drills during that week, which probably is not the case. Probably all the way around. He does very little drills and he actually runs them or use those kilometers to be specific in his running. You can't accumulate 300 kilometers a week because basically there's a time component to it as well. So you need to rest, you need to sleep and these kind of things. So you only got a certain amount of hours available that you can do effectively training. And that means if you want to accumulate 300 kilometers per week, that's a substantial amount of running that has to happen every day. That means also that for those hours you got available, you either have to run like really fast now, or which we know that they don't do. They have a very nice distribution, like most other people have, mindful about how they distribute intensity. But that means also that you don't have very much time for drills. So again, to summarize it, I would say that no, we don't use very much drills. I'm not against drills, absolutely. Rather the contrary, drills really have a place, but they have a place if you have identified that here is something that we need to address, and you think, okay, fine, I think that by doing this we might be able to mitigate or work on that specific skill, but with one single purpose. And that is not to improve your drill. It is to translate that skill that you're practicing there back into a higher velocity for the same distance. So basically being faster on the race distance. Otherwise, it's waste of time. I think that too many people are overcomplicating things. And again, this is about being mindful also as a coach. And that is that as a coach also, I think it is very important to try to observe the athletes. And that for many coaches, of course, they are not able to be in the place where the athletes are. But thus, it is more important to maybe have, let's say, a couple of questions, get on the phone and other things with the athletes so to understand a little bit what they feel. How do they feel different things? What do they feel actually hold them back? And the first time you ask this question, you might not get any answer at all, because it's also about developing a language. You need to develop a way of, let's say, terminology or language that allow you to effectively understand each other, and that takes time. So I would say when you are more mindful as an athlete and also as a coach, and you observe your running technique and you are looking at, okay, so when I do really this more like exhaustive sessions or key sessions, for example, I feel that what really holds me back here is this. It's absolutely not a problem to be wrong, because it basically means that if you didn't nail it the first time, you're not going to spend more time on it, so you're progressing. And basically what you have to remember that, again, there are many things we can measure. There are even more things we can't measure yet, even though we are getting closer and closer to be able to measure a lot of things, much or even more things. But the point is that the worst thing you can do is not do anything. The best thing you can do is actually just start doing something, and then start and be mindful, be observational, try to learn from it, because this is actually how you progress. This is how you learn you learn more about yourself. The coach learns more about you, and it allows you to progress, make progression in what you do. So again, key sessions first, of course. This is where you should be most mindful about what do you feel hold you back, and try to develop a language where you are able to convey the message, and also for the coach, so that he is able to understand the message in a way that you are able to find maybe drills, for example, to start address it. But then also at the same time, I think it's important to establish also a benchmark. Okay, this is where we are. So you both have a benchmark on both. Okay, so this is how I'm executing the session currently, and this is how I've progressed lately. So obviously, stagnation, if you have stagnation over a longer period of time, then of course it makes sense to start to see whether there are things you can do. Just remember also that if you are time constrained and you're training 5 hours a week, it's a limit to probably how fast you can run. You can't necessarily expect to beat Christian and Gustav if you only train 5 hours a week as a triathlete. So again, you have to put things in perspective. But if you start to stagnate and you don't have progress, if you have progress, continue with what you do. If you start to stagnate, and I don't mean like stagnating on one session, I'm thinking now more like stagnation over a block, for example. You don't have development through a block in the same way that you expect. So before you go into a block, I would even say that, okay, this ties back to the training planning. But you basically have, okay, so in this block, we're going to focus on this. This is what we want to develop. So this is the current benchmark, and we want to progress this many percents or whatever, improve this much during this block. If you then see, for example, this is a 4-week block, and after 2 weeks, you're not on track, or you see there are things there, and training really just goes on rails there. There are no sicknesses, no injuries, no nothing that are holding you back. Then, of course, you can start to look a little bit into, okay, what is there any reason? Are we present? Are we mindful in a training session? Are we really executing with the highest quality? Do like all these kind of factors? If we don't, then of course, or if we do that and all those things are good, then is when I would say that, okay, fine, let's look into where do you feel? What do you feel is holding you back? So when you get progress throughout the session and you're really starting to struggle, these kind of, what is it natural? Is it natural that you actually now we are at the point where you actually are naturally reaching a limit? So we can't really expect a lot of progress. It was more like we hoped for progress, but again, the progress we can expect now is very low. Or is it so? No. This is we are a place where we know that we should be able to progress much more, and all the conditions are met. Then I would say, okay, where do we start? And this is about then being mindful about, okay, what do we feel hold us back? And this is when you need a benchmark. So you know, okay, this is where I am currently. This is how well I do the session, for example, currently. Then you decide, okay, what drill or what kind of exercise, so whatever you want to do, strength training, that you want to incorporate. So, but then it's important also to then establish a benchmark for that, because you also want to track the progress on your drill. Otherwise, you are just wasting time on doing some drill, and you have actually no idea whether you're actually progressing on the drill even. So you need actually to establish a benchmark for your drill as well. The first, I would say that here it's important to establish two benchmark. The first one is basically just, okay, the first drill you do, you have we're going to do this drill, and we now want to make this much progress on that drill, for example. So then the first time you do this drill, you use that call it as a reference session, for example. Now what you will expect is that over the next sections you're going to do this session, you will have quite a bit of progress on that session there. Naturally, because maybe it's a new drill, you haven't done it before, and things that we have never done before, and we start to execute them, we naturally progress like very quickly. But then after some point, you are past this familiarization period, and this will be different depending on let's say the modality and the complexity of the drill that you are doing. And this is when you said, okay, fine, this drill, we expect you to start to things are, you are through this familiarization phase after, let's say, 2 weeks or something like this, 4 weeks, depending on what it is. Strength training, I would typically say that you should probably have like a 4-week familiarization period before you really set like a benchmark. So you establish a reference, then you see how much you develop over that period.
Today's episode is sponsored by Maurten, the leader in fueling for endurance sports. With patented hydrogel technology, Maurten found a way for athletes like Christian and Gustav to tolerate more carbohydrate during training and racing. The advances in performance when using the Maurten gels, drink mixers, and bicarb system have been clear. It's the fuel behind triathlon gold medals, world championships, and world records. Hydrogel technology has no added flavour, preservatives, or colours, and is made with only natural ingredients, so it's clean. Only what's required to aid performance, nothing more. And now you can benefit from the same world-class fueling system thanks to an exclusive one-time code that will give our listeners 20% off the Maurten 1/52 collection, a curated selection of products to fuel a 1 week of structured training. Especially in training, every fueling moment counts. It's how athletes adapt and race better. Simply add the 1/52 collection to your basket at maurten.com and enter the code in our show notes at the checkout. So we've got 4 weeks. So we've got a familiarization phase done 4 weeks, and that could be strength training, that could be a drill, that could be anything else. Now we have a baseline, and we have a predicted trajectory or a hopeful trajectory for transfer to training, which is to say, I have this deficiency, whatever it is. My theory is that this intervention, X intervention, should help that, drill, strength training, whatever. Now I'm applying that. I have a baseline in that. Now I'm applying it, and I'm hoping for a certain percentage of transfer. So they're never going to be 100%. The more specific it is, the more transfer you will get.
Exactly.
So
the less specific it is, the less transfer you will get. So even if you don't have, if it's very unspecific and you have 100% increase, maybe only a couple of percent will actually translate to specificity. The more specific it is, if you have like 10% increase in something that's very specific, you can probably almost get 10% out of that in true performance as well.
And that's specificity, right? That is the definition of specificity. And specificity comes across any number of criteria. It's posture, it's time, it's speed, it's all those things. So it's a very long continuum, but you get a percentage improvement, you see a percentage of transfer to training, and then you reevaluate. It's really that simple. It's theory intervention, test, retest, adjust, and course correct as needed.
And if you then basically see that when you basically do a retest, so you've done you set the reference, and then you do a benchmark, and then basically you keep track of that. Let's say that in the intervention or the drill or that program that you are putting on the side as well, like strength training. And then after, you have to say that, okay, educate yourself a little bit on how much time it would normally take for you to progress on a certain skill. So if, for example, if that you want to increase your ability to do heavier squats, for example, then talk to a strength coach or something like that and just ask, okay, how much progression should I expect here? And then I think that a good strength coach can probably ask you a couple of questions, and I can already probably give you pretty good ideas of how much you can expect to progress over a month, for example, or every week. If you now don't see any progression in that intervention there after you set the benchmark, then you have to also look even here now on your drill or exercise, strength conditioning, and you have to look at that and see, okay, should I change something here? Is there something there now that holding me back? I'm executing this not correctly, for example, and that's why I'm not progressing. And then evaluate whether, no, just need a little bit more time here, and then we expect it to change. But I think it is important that every time you incorporate a drill, you incorporate a strength training program, you set 2 deadlines. One, where you evaluate the progress of what you do, and then there's a final cut. The first one basically is acting as more like okay, are we actually doing the right thing here? Because at some point, if you have no change in performance, but again, remember, you're not looking to get stronger in the gym, you're looking to get faster in a triathlon. And if you don't get fast in a triathlon, and then maybe, of course, you can always say, but then every triathlon is different, wind is different, courses are different. Yes, okay, fine. But then look at least at your running specific sessions and key sessions. Do you actually make progress on your key sessions? And if you don't see a progress on your key sessions,
and probably just a butt in there, aligned with the intervention you've taken, because you should see progression in those sessions anyway. So there's a normal rate of progression you should be seeing there. So you've either taken an intervention to accelerate that or to break through a plateau. Yeah. There are 2 scenarios that you would incorporate something new in that respect.
To break through a plateau, I would probably use specificity. Yeah. But to work on something that is a limiter, this is where I could maybe be more inclined to go less and more unspecific to try to address that. But you need to set like some deadlines for where you agree with the athlete, or you agree together with the coach that, okay, we expect this much change in this specific drill or strength exercise that you're doing, so much progress in within 2 weeks, so much in within 4 weeks, so much within 8 weeks, and so on. And then basically you have to decide, okay, so how much do we expect, or how much do we hope this will translate back into velocity, for example, in running. If it doesn't do that, then you have to actually just, at some point, you have to first evaluate, are we doing the right thing? Should we make some changes here? Is there something in the way we execute the drills or the strength training here that doesn't allow us to transfer it, or we are not even progressing on these drills or strength training sessions, and make changes to that. Don't be afraid of that, because that's the way you learn. And then after another certain period, you just have to say that no, we made enough iterations here. We are not able to make it translate, and this is when you basically make a change. It doesn't mean that what you're doing is wrong. You are probably on the right track because you already start to experiment and trying to address where it is. So you're getting closer and closer to the problem. But getting closer and closer to the problem, or getting closer and closer to actually making progress, that is a windy road sometimes, and you have to be patient. The worst thing that the society actually have adopted today is an expectancy for that, like we're gonna have like exponential growth in everything we do. It's rather the opposite. You have inverse exponential growth. You normally respond very quickly in the beginning, and then it will start to taper off, and you don't feel that progress anymore. It doesn't mean you don't make progress, because progress just happens on other places. Like, for example, that we learn more, we get more experience, we understand better what works for us and doesn't work for us. We maybe even understand more detail about what works for us when and not. So again, patience is also a skill that we actually just have to learn as well. And the higher level you come, the more patient you have to be in order to expect maybe sometimes also a change in result. But again, agree on deadlines for when you pull a plug on a drill before you start it. Otherwise, you might just say, no, this will take 10 years. No, you have to have like, this is the expectation for how much I want to progress this season. Agree on that together with your coach, and then you have to evaluate all the interventions and everything you do in that light.
Yep. So this is going to be a hard question to answer, and I'm not sure it has an answer, or the answer is really simple. But in the context of an age group athlete, what's the longest run you would suggest in training for something like for an Ironman or a 70.3? We can use both, either or, something like that. I mean, is the answer as simple as 42.2 and 21.1 kilometers? Is it that simple, or is there something that you should be considering, cutting that back because it's not necessary to go all the way? Because I know in marathoning, they'll often say, well, historically, they've said things like, you probably don't need to go more than 35 or 38 kilometers. But there's a lot of people now, Kelvin Kipton being one of them, who's going 40 plus regularly.
Yeah, I like to simplify this quite a bit, and that is that if you regularly do 42.2 kilometers in your run, or let's say your competition distance in running or duration or more, and you at the same time are able also to work on the higher intensity, medium and higher intensities as well, running a marathon will be a walk in the park.
Yep.
It's like an everyday undertaking for you. It's like, a marathon. Yeah, I'm doing a marathon today, tomorrow, over tomorrow, whatever. Doesn't matter. I don't care. I've done this multiple times before. That's a completely different things for a guy that maybe runs, let's say, if you run 15 kilometers a week, and that's like a couple of kilometers per day. Like running a marathon is going to be a massive undertaking for you.
Yep.
So again, this comes down to specificity and adaptation, these kind of things. Of course, we are really like bluntly just oversimplifying here now. But I think the most important thing is, again, to look at the limiters. What holds you back from running faster? And that doesn't mean necessarily running a marathon will make you faster. If you only have the possibility to run 60 kilometers per week, or 50 kilometers per week, I would probably say that spending one of the days running a marathon is probably not very smart. Maybe in a larger picture where you look at it more on a monthly basis, or even a block, a mesocycle level, for example. Yeah, surely then maybe you could put in like a marathon there as a part of it, but you have to look at it as a bigger periodization, and then it can absolutely make sense to do it. But it is important to make sure that it doesn't become a limiter. It ties back to everything else we have discussed, and that is that you have to understand what is holding you back, what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, and how do you address them. And if one way to address them to really become faster is running a marathon, well, then it's obvious, go run a marathon.
Yep.
Yeah. But I like to bring Christian and Gustav absolutely when we go, when there's Ironman, yes, bring them up there, because they have enough running volume that we can actually spend quite a few sessions over a month, for example, during a mesocycle on doing marathon running.
Just to help listeners to really contextualize that, in that example you gave of, say, running 50 kilometers a week, spending 80% of your weekly running volume on one day doesn't make sense 100%, but it may make sense to spend one of the weeks of 80%, right? That 80% 1 week in a longer term vision, and that would probably exist somewhere between 3 and 6 weeks out from the true race day, because you've built up towards that. You've probably been going maybe once a month and doing one longer run, spending one of those weeks a month, building up that long run such that you can get close to it because you've addressed it as a limiter. So if your ability as a limiter is whatever, and running a marathon or close to it will help, you need to build to that over a longer period of time. And I think understanding the context in a longer time frame across a season, across multiple months, and even within a month, rather than thinking about everything in a week. Yeah, makes sense.
Again, I think this also is in the context of how much hours you also got available as well, because the distance you have a possibility to run during a week, for example, is 50-60 kilometers. I think that then probably running a marathon or close to a marathon the week before is gonna not be that won't bring out your game on race day, because
recovery will be too long from that.
Yeah, and you can't
tolerate that load.
Yeah, and you are also it's and I don't think necessarily that will be the main limiter for you either. Of course, again, you would find those cases that maybe would benefit from it as well. So you would have to look a little bit on case-to-case basis. But generally speaking, I would say the more volume you do, so if you are capable of like running between 100 and 120, 150 kilometers a week in your program, then for sure, dialing in a couple of marathons over a block is probably quite good to work on other limiters as well, because then you are also getting into the domain of more that you absolutely don't want the specificity to hold you back either. How to make this simple?
I think that makes a ton of sense, which is you need to contextualize things. So you need to consider what your weekly volume is as a macro concept, but then in the run specific discipline as well, and how that plays into this. It speaks to what you said about tapering. It speaks to a number of things, which is what you habitually do is going to limit and inform what you can do in any one day.
Yep.
So it'll inform how long it takes you to recover from things. It'll inform how you can tolerate load. So that needs to be the context with which you plan things.
Yeah.
So if you're only running 40 kilometers a week, then the Ironman marathon is going to be as stressful as a training week of running. And so your taper needs to consider that. And so does your training, because you can't I'm going to spend my whole weekly running volume on one day and anticipate recovering fine from that, because you probably won't. Or if you do, it's going to take probably a month, not a couple of days, which people who are running 120 kilometers a week, if they do 40 kilometers on one day, yeah, it's not so bad for them, because they probably had a couple of days off before. It's now all of a sudden you've done 40 kilometers on one day, which is a third of your weekly running volume, but you had 2 days without running. So now all of a sudden you've done a third of your weekly running volume across 3 days. All of a sudden it sounds really reasonable. So that stuff is often overlooked, but I think is important. We are brought to you today by Plasmade. Plasmade is a proprietary liquid performance and recovery supplement formulated using only one active ingredient, French maritime pine bark extract, aka PBE. PBE is an adaptogen which triggers your body to produce a stabilized form of nitric oxide, which is a powerful vasodilator, improving blood flow to muscles and the brain. Plasmade is for use pre and post exercise, augmenting other energy and hydration supplementation used. In addition to all of this, Plasmade also has powerful anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects, which aid in recovery from training and competition. For your 25% discount on Plasmade and to learn more, head to the show notes.
But I think also one way to bring in somewhat more specificity to it is that you can, because one of the consequences of running long is, of course, that intensity is going to go down.
Yep.
This is also where I like much more also to think of RPE not in terms of a two-dimensional, like a one-dimensional system where you just say, okay, this is like a whatever intensity, and you use it as a form to gauge intensity. I like much more to use RPE as a function of fatigue.
Yep.
So basically, it's both a combinator of X and Y.
X and Y being X is intensity, and Y is duration.
No, opposite.
No, opposite. So Y is intensity, X is duration.
Yes.
So that's to say...
or distance for that matter. Yeah.
So that's to say if I'm running an RPE of what most people would use it, if I say my RPE is 3, that will probably increase as duration goes along.
Yes.
So to say I'm running an RPE of 3 lacks a level of textual detail there, contextual detail for you.
Exactly. That's why I like much more to use RPE, whether we should call it something different, but basically as a function of fatigue. So, for example, one way I normally I double check this with my athletes is that I actually ask them also after. So, for example, if an athlete tell me that they are at say 7, so we would normally say, okay, 7 sits very close to maximum lactic steady state, for example, or metabolic steady state, 7 to 8. And of course, I have a fairly good idea then of how much, for example, carbohydrates they're using, and I know approximately how much they're feeding of carbohydrates. I know approximately how large their carbohydrate stores are. We have expectations for how long they would be able to sustain that kind of intensity. So a control question for me is like, if an athlete says that, okay, this feels like a 7 or 8, I would immediately ask, so you can continue to do this for another hour at this certain intensity, because that should be the expectation. If you're at a 7, for example, you should be able to do it for, let's say, another hour. If I stay here now, this is something I could do for an hour more. Okay, perfect. Then it's fairly well calibrated. Yep. But sometimes, because 0 to 10, for example, it's a arbitrary scale, or basically it lacks a bit of context. Yep. But if you ask somebody, and they're sitting at a certain intensity, and you just add a time component. Can you do this for 30 minutes? Like how much? 10, 20, 30, 60, 90, 2 hours, 4 hours to that. Then basically you force them to think, okay, maybe this is a little bit too hard. No, I don't think that. Okay, so dial it back, because that's what we're actually focusing on here. So even though you ask somebody, okay, does this feel like where are you? This is call it, let's say we are on a threshold session, for example, to use a very, very vague expression. But most people use that, so that's a good reference. And let's say that you're going to be on a 7 on this scale now, this session. If you feel at a 7 towards the end of the session,
That's very different than if you started at 7.
For me, that's almost like, okay, so you can just continue then your threshold session now for another hour. Is that what you say? No. Okay, so where are you then? I could probably, how many more minutes can you do this? Okay, probably, if you really like force me, maybe another 5-10 minutes. Okay, fine, but then you're not at a 7 anymore. Then you are at a 9. And at the moment you actually stop and ask you how hard, and and I say, no, you need to do another minute. I said, no, I can't. I'm really exhausted. I have to soft pedal in order to be able to continue. Okay, fine. Then you are probably pretty close to a 10.
Yep.
But the 10 for me is not something where, like, even when I do max, like all out with Christian and Gustav even, if they come in and they say to me, this is a 9. Okay, continue. Of course, I'm exaggerating a little bit now, but I do actually ask them straight after they come in, was this a 10? Or how did this feel? And if we agreed on this is going to be like a max, for example, then it has to be a 10. Otherwise, you didn't max out your capabilities. And that is that's independently, or whether it's an interval lasting for 10 seconds, or whether it's an interval lasting for 10 hours or 10 minutes. It really, a 10 is basically all out for that specific intensity that you are nailing at. So you've exhausted yourself. And that's why, for example, if you ask, for example, Calvin or Kipchoge, for example, to go on a treadmill and run at 21 kilometers per hour, and you do like 10 minutes of that, if they say that's like, for most people, that they wouldn't even be close to even complete that. But they should at least then report that this feels like a 4, 5, something like this. But if you ask them again after 2 hours, they will probably be very close to a 10 on that one. Same with Christian and Gustav as well. When they are doing, call it treasure interval, ask them early in the session, it might not even be like a 7. It can even be, they see that the numbers are there, they're right, but it feels, feels good, I feel strong today. Yeah, this is a 6. Doesn't mean that then you should bring it up to a 7 and then force them to go higher in power, because you're early in the session and you have maybe now 60, 70, 80, maybe even more minutes in front of you, where you're basically going to accumulate now time, duration on that specific power output. And that is going to bring you most likely close to a 9 towards the end of the session, and maybe sometimes even to a 10. But the times you're going to go to a 10, you have to be like really mindful about, and you have to have in my philosophy, you have to have a really good reason for why you want to bring somebody to a 10.
And that speaks a lot to something we talked about earlier, which is kind of that reps in reserve concept that you really liked. And I tend to like it as well, given my background, where you need to understand how far you are from failure or exhaustion or something like that. And that gives a layer of texture. And that actually, in strength training, RPE tracks really well with reps in reserve. And so I think there's something to be brought across to endurance training, which is probably what you're doing.
Yeah, we already covered it. So I think I said that in one of the earlier episodes, that I like repetitions in reserve, or like we call intervals in reserve. This is where I ask the athletes how much more time could they actually do. And if they say, I could do probably another 15 minutes, and if I know the intervals we are doing is like 10 minutes long, well, okay, fine. Then you can probably do at least 1.5 more interval before, maybe even 2 more intervals before you exhaust. And that is something that I really like, because it means basically that in a session, if we are looking to bring an athlete close to exhaustion, and that is the goal, not to exhaustion, but closer to it, because we are now having a key session. So we are looking to make a dent in the curve, as we talked about in one of the previous episodes. That would basically be, okay, fine, today is the day where he is really ready for that. So today we are actually going to bring in at least 1 more interval, and then maybe another one as well.
We talked a bit already about running distances, weekly volumes, these sort of things. And the answer to this might be, it depends on the gap analysis and the performance model. But in general, would you say it's better to intensify run training or extensify it? So do we want to be running certain durations and then making that more intense broadly? Or do we want to be running a certain intensity and extensifying that broadly?
This is, of course, again, something that depends, because you want to spend the time where you get results, or where you're able to move the needle. And whether you're gonna extensify or intensify, I would probably say that like initially, if I had no information, I would probably just say extensify.
Yep.
But the problem with extensifying, it basically then tells that, or then it basically dictates that you need to have more time available.
Yep.
If you don't have more time available, obviously you don't have very much opportunity to do very much extensifying. You can of course decide to exactly like start to bring down, for example, pauses, for example, breaks, so you condense your workouts more, and in that sense extensify to some extent. But you'll anyway very soon face the time constraints of that. So that means basically then that the next step you then basically have available is that you need to start to intensify instead.
Yeah, and that's all in the context of a profile that dictates that extensification is possible or meaningful, rather than, if you've got a very flat horizontal profile, then extensifying isn't necessarily the answer. You probably need to intensify for a while before you then extensify.
Yeah.
Something I've been very interested in is, given some of the work you've done with companies, is super shoes, proportion of time in and out of them, so to speak. So if we call a super shoe higher stack, more new age foam and carbon plated, so we call that a super shoe, is how much time should we be spending in and out of super shoes as a proportion of run week? And does this change across the season, I guess, with the context of age group athletes?
So then I want to introduce the term high efficiency shoes as opposed to a super shoe. And the reason for that is because it, again, of course, fits better into the performance model as well, where we talk about efficiency and let's say different layers and different equipment, different tools, different methods and everything.
And that distinction probably answers a question for listeners who've been listening. Because then they straight away go, oh, that's how he views it. Therefore, this is where it fits into a system, which is the beauty of the performance model, is it allows you to categorize where these interventions, where these tools, where these techniques will fit into a model, because you have a structured way of thinking. And whether it's the performance model or not that people are using as their model of performance, or your performance model, or the Norwegian model of performance, or whatever you want to call that, having a system allows you to make decisions and allows you to understand where things and concepts fit. And that's the most important thing, systematic thinking, regardless of which system you use. This is one, but there are others. Yeah,
exactly. So I would say that it's very tempting to, of course, run a lot in high efficiency shoes, just because
they're fun.
Yeah, and you run longer for the same time, you run faster. So I have no problem understanding that it can be quite fun to run in high efficiency shoes. But one thing that we have to remember is that two ways that high efficiency shoes are working or making you more efficient. One is let's say call it acutely, that it has properties that helps certain biomechanic traits. And by that I mean that, for example, because you have a carbon plate in the sole, that means that, for example, we know that the foot arc, you have a lot of small muscle groups, which is fatigue faster than, for example, your legs and your thighs. And when you're running, what happens there is that in the beginning of a run, you typically have like a very nice stride and all these kind of things. One of the things that one have to remember is that, for example, Christian and Gustav, they have virtually no change in their stride efficiency from the beginning to the end of a marathon after they've been swimming and biking. So it's not like it's natural to, or like everybody fatigues like significantly. No, it depends very much more on training. But of course, if you never used to run a marathon, that's of course the benefit of having a big volume in your training. And we also just touched upon Calvin and Kipchoge, for example, as well, which are running 300 Ks a week at most. Of course, then a marathon is a walk in a park, because it basically is just such a small proportion of even what you are used to do every day or even every week, that fatigue is not a problem in the same sense as a guy that is basically running maybe like 5 hours a week, or even maybe less, 4 hours a week, because then a marathon is actually quite a solid undertaking. A huge jump up even from the training they are used to do. And in that case, you will of course experience far more fatigue, because you don't have the specificity and all other things that you basically gain from having a large volume. So Then back to the shoes and efficiency and so on. What the carbon plate basically does is that those small muscle groups that you have in your foot, or that's one of the muscle groups that basically fatigues very quickly. What the carbon plated shoes does is that they basically offload a lot of these small muscle groups that are in your foot. And they basically, if you have a good, like a really well-designed shoe, so you have the carbon plate that sits underneath and basically supports all these small muscle groups that sits in the foot there. And then basically if you have a good last that sits on top as well, that anchors very well around your ankles, or let's say, around your foot, lower leg, they basically will, that carbon plate will help transmit parts of that load onto your legs, or let's say your Achilles and legs as well. And that means also that now you won't necessarily fatigue equally fast in those small muscle groups as well, because you're shifting, or let's say you're distributing the load a little bit more evenly around on bigger muscle groups as well. But one thing we also have to remember is that there's a reason for why we designed the way we are. So we have this small muscle group in the foot because they are there also to help dampening, take away, so that you don't get big loads on like concentrated places in your foot. So there's a time and there's a place for carbon plated shoes as well. I'm gonna exaggerate now to try to explain a little bit more where we want, and that is that if you go to the gym and you only train your upper body, well, you're not gonna get big legs from that. You'll get a big upper body. And that's to say a little bit the same thing here as well. If you use a carbon plated shoe, that will not give the same training stimulus to the small muscle groups that are in your foot as well, as opposed to having what I would call a low efficiency shoe that basically forces you to actively work more also with your foot and the small muscles that are in the foot, and use that also for dampening. So that's why you should basically not only go out and only do running in your carbon plated shoe, because yes, initially you will probably have better performance, but that performance will drop off as basically you are starting now to lose maybe a little bit of that stimulus in the muscles that sits in the foot, and that's not going to make you a faster runner. So that's why it is important to alternate a little bit. You use a little bit high efficiency shoes, you use a little bit low efficiency shoes, so that you basically also maintain the function of the muscles that or the properties of the muscles that sits also in the foot.
Yep. And so that's the acute benefit. You mentioned like a subacute chronic benefit as well. So is that about accumulating more volume as a result of being able to run faster?
No, I would rather say that like acutely, of course, you'll run faster.
Yep.
But then more chronically, what will happen if you only run in carbon-plated shoes is that actually what happens is that you lose efficiency again. So you actually, when you have if you have never been running in carbon-plated shoes before, you take that on, you're already there, probably in your first session already, immediately feel, okay, there's a difference, and it might even show up in several of your metrics. But if you only start now using carbon plated shoes, is that you will start to see that maybe it's worst case, you are not progressing anymore. You even maybe stagnate and go backwards slightly. And that's why it is important to alternate this a little bit, because you have to remember that the carbon plated shoes is something that gives you an additional benefit. It's not like the carbon plated shoes, it's not like that carbon plate is completely stiff. It is quite flexible. So that means that you still need some strength in your foot in order to don't collapse fully. And again, remember, the reason why we train is to become better, and that goes for both the whole body, but also come from parts of the body. So providing also more stimulus to the foots as well, so that you put it in there, that's good. But I think again, specificity. Of course, you can't, if you only run low efficiency shoes and then suddenly on race day you show up in your carbon plated shoes. I don't know. I don't know if I would do that either. So if I were to condense this down, okay, so should you use, for age groupers, should you use high efficiency shoes, and how much you should use in these kind of things? I would definitely say that don't use high efficiency shoes all the time. Make sure that you alternate between high efficiency shoes and low efficiency shoes and so on. And then after Paris, we'll come back with very much more specific details on how to periodicize this. Answer to it.
Yep, yeah. Perfect. Alrighty, I think that's a really nice bow put on the running episode. So thank you, Olav, for joining us for that one. And we'll be back again with our next episode. And there it is. The run is done, and that is us done for training. Now, of course, we are not done for the season. We are back next week with nutrition. So to make sure you don't miss that one, subscribe to the podcast. Of course, rate the podcast to help other people discover it, and share it with a friend who you think would enjoy the run episode. Of course, you may also have questions. Please do send those in. As I've mentioned before, our final episode of the season, which is coming up, will cover some of your questions. And so do send them in via Instagram DM to the Centara Tech Instagram account, via email to info@centaragroup.com, or if you're on Spotify, down the bottom there's a Q&A section, so do that there. Thank you very much again, and we will see you next week.